So I've just read Timonthy Snyder's book on Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. You may have heard of it because it's currently top of the New York Times bestsellers list. Tim Snyder is a Yale professor of history, and he's collated his learning on the 20th century dictatorships and the conditions that gave rise to them into these 20 simple lessons we can all learn from our turbulent past. Now, I highly recommend the book. I think everyone who hears this should buy it. It's a fascinating and very short read. It's like 80 pages. It'll take you less than a couple of hours. But I want to go through each of these 20 lessons in a series over the next couple of days. That sound alright? This book could not be more relevant. See, the 20th century dictatorships arose as a direct response to the first wave of globalization and international trade in the late 19th century. Because one uncomfortable truth is that globalization brings an average improvement in abstract terms like GDP, but it also produces, on a localized level, many forms of inequality. This is how Brexit happened over here, with people like me and other lawyers and bankers in big metropolises like London benefiting from globalization and voting to remain. But people in smaller or rural communities had to deal with relocation, unemployment, and a kind of immigration that impacted both their prosperity and their safety, so they voted Brexit. Globalization, in addition to that, also breeds resentment, because if you're not doing so well, you now have even more people to compare yourself to and to be jealous of. The 20th century dictatorships were a response to this. As Tim Snyder says, they put a face on globalization. Oh, it's the capitalists' fault, or it's the liberals, or it's the Jews. Today, maybe you could say it's the Mexicans, it's the Muslims, and still the Jews. As I said in my earlier segment today, history is not something to be ashamed of, but it's something to learn from so we don't repeat past mistakes. And this focus on our mistakes is definitely the best part of Snyder's book. Because it would have been easy to have made this book all about Trump, about how he's evil and all the parallels with those autocratic regimes. And as you can imagine, there's quite a few parallels. But that's not the point of the book. The point is about us, the people, about how we react to overreach, to, the small things that erode our customs, our institutions, and our constitutions, until those acts become normalized and we're too desensitized to react. It's a bit like, that old quote about boiling a frog alive by increasing the temperature slowly but incrementally, so the frog doesn't notice the threat to its life. Snyder highlights how complicit or merely complacent people were in many ways the biggest factor in the success of those 20th century tyrannies. And it's those lessons that we need to hear most carefully, because as always, the power is with us, both in good and in evil. We're going through each of the 20 lessons contained in On Tyranny, the book by Timonthy Snyder, which came out a few weeks ago, and which is a fascinating look at how the 20th century dictatorships arose and what those circumstances have in common with today. The first lesson is, do not obey in advance. Tim Snyder says, most of the power in authoritarianism is given freely. This is the idea that after an early success by a ruler or a party, people voluntarily started adapting to the new situation and even anticipating what the ruler would demand and offering those things without being asked. This basically told the rulers what the people were happy to compromise without even being asked to. This anticipatory obedience, Snyder argues, taught power what it could do and what it could demand. The book gives the example of the 1938 annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany. So no orders had been given, but local Austrian Nazi sympathizers immediately started capturing Jews and beating them and stealing their property. And even non-Nazis either took part in the looting or just looked on with curiosity. They did nothing about it. And this attitude really gave the Nazis an idea of what would be possible in the future. They went, oh, okay, so you're okay with this? Cool, then maybe you'll be okay with something bigger as well. And 6 months later, what do you know? We had the Kristallnacht, the national pogrom, in which 200 synagogues and about 7,000 Jewish shops were destroyed or damaged, and which many count as the official beginning of the final solution. And this is why it's so important that when the Muslim ban was signed by Trump earlier this year, so many people turned up at airports to protest. Now, I don't usually agree with protests, and certainly not with all protests, but this one served a really strong purpose, because it clearly demonstrated that Americans would no longer put up with policies based on purely racial or ideological terms. Had there not been such a demonstration, fortunately we can only speculate on what might have happened next. So the lesson here is, we shouldn't just adapt without reflecting on what it is that's happening. We shouldn't assume that rulers truly have the power to do what they want and go with the flow. Because especially in the beginning, authoritarian rulers are weak and they rely on people to go along with what they want. And if we go along with it, they might take another inch. And if we obey in advance, they don't even need to take that inch because we hand it over freely. The second lesson in Timonthy Snyder's book on tyranny is defend institutions. Institutions don't defend themselves, they aren't invulnerable to attack. They require our active support. So just because somebody comes to power through democracy and elections doesn't mean that they wish to maintain democracy or the electoral system. Sometimes those institutions can either be destroyed, which is what the Soviets did when they came to power and transformed the system into a brutal one-party dictatorship. The whole institutions were based on the Soviet idea. Or the institutions can become shadows of their former selves, empty symbols, a bit like today's, quote, democracy in Russia. You know, you get Putin getting elected, and when the constitution doesn't allow him to stand again, he'll step down again, in quotes, and be prime minister for a while, until he can be elected again as president. This is also what happened with the Roman Emperor Augustus, who was consistently, quote, elected for 44 years until his death. So it was all just for show, right? The institutions are technically alive, but they're meaningless. Blind faith in the strength of our institutions can have horrible effects. And this is a chilling quote in the book, and it's copied from a German newspaper in 1933, published just after Hitler came to power. Now listen to this. This is what the German liberals, specifically the Jews, because it's a Jewish newspaper, thought would happen, or rather what would not happen. And they're talking about the Nazis. They will not suddenly deprive German Jews of their constitutional rights, nor enclose them in ghettos, nor subject them to the jealous and murderous impulses of the mob. They cannot do this because a number of crucial factors hold powers in check, and they clearly do not want to go down that road. When one acts as a European power, the whole atmosphere tends towards ethical reflection upon one's better self and away from revisiting one's earlier oppositional posture. So yeah, that's the German liberal Jews in 1933. Imagine the New York Times writing that today. And we all know what actually happened. Institutions don't mean anything without our defense. So the author's lesson is, pick an institution you care about, whether it's a law or a newspaper or anything else, and take its side and stick to it. Make it a mission in life to defend your institutions. Beware the one-party state. Dictatorships don't start off as these all-powerful systems, or even as dictatorships really. Instead, they usually win an initial election, a usual ordinary democratic election, just like the Nazis did in 1933, or the communists did in Czechoslovakia in 1945. And then they start slicing away at the opposition bit by bit. They distract the people while making it more and more difficult for the opposition to exist, until, voila, little do you know, you've got a one-party system. There's this amazing quote in the book. Quote, "You don't know when you make love for the last time that you're making love for the last time." Voting is like that. It's brilliant, right? Tim Snyder, the author, asks, do you think that the Russians voting in 1990 thought that those would be the last genuinely free elections they'd ever have? Because, guys, it's been almost 30 years since, and those are still the last free elections Russia's had. So it all starts by eroding the institutions from within through all sorts of means. And you guys in the States have got some crazy shit you're dealing with, from voter laws that I don't even understand, to gerrymandering, which I also don't quite understand, and the frankly jaw-dropping influence of corporate interests in politics via campaign financing at a level we Europeans find just unbelievable. I'll read you this quote from the book. "We believe that we have checks and balances, but have rarely faced a situation like the present, when the less popular of the two parties controls every lever of power at the federal level, as well as the majority of state houses. The party that exercises such control proposes few policies that are popular within the society at large, and several that are generally unpopular, and thus must either fear democracy or weaken it." Well, shit, guys. So I guess the lesson is, be vigilant and oppose all threats to the multi-party system, because you might not like the guys across the aisle with their Bibles or their political correctness, but having them there to argue with is a way better thing than the alternative. Lesson 4 of Timonthy Snyder's book on tyranny is take responsibility for the face of the world. And this one's a little controversial, or rather I'm going to make it a little controversial. So I thought it was stated a little poorly, but the point is this: we shouldn't ignore, normalize, or get used to the flourishing of symbols of division. Because the next thing you know, those symbols become the norm, and suddenly people who don't display the symbols are seen as suspicious. Tim Snyder starts by saying, the symbols of today enable the reality of tomorrow. And that's a bit of a Wittgensteinian way of looking at the world. You know, language shapes reality, and in this case, symbols like, say, swastikas. Now, I'm not sure this is the best way to make the point, putting the emphasis on the symbols. Because, I mean, okay, you see a swastika somewhere, you scrub it off, you denounce it, whatever. But what if the symbol is more subtle? What can you really do there? I kept imagining this after Brexit, right? That people started wearing these Britain First pins in their jackets, or just, you know, British flags, right? Here, a British flag is a bit like a Make America Great Again cap, you know? It's inoffensive on its own, but, you know, it might tell you something about the person wearing it. Not something necessarily negative, but it says something. But say more and more people start wearing the pin, and suddenly a few years down the line, and you're on a subway and you look around and 90% of the people around you are wearing the British flag pin. Now, other people might be looking at you who are not wearing the pin as an outsider, and maybe they're thinking, is he an enemy? And it doesn't have to be a British flag, it might be anything. It could be a feminist symbol, or it could be a hashtag Black Lives Matter t-shirt. The point is, the emphasis here shouldn't be on the symbol, but on herd mentality, the pack instinct. We must always question the pack instinct. And this is something I don't see enough of. And you know what? You might be nodding right now, but some of you do it too, you know. It's the reason I get way fewer shares whenever I talk about terrorism. Why is that? I mean, everything I'm saying is 100% factual, it's definitely reasonable and logical, and more often than not, it's also compassionate. I mean, if I say so myself. And I know this because I have yet to hear a single, and I mean a single one, just one, convincing argument calling in to say, oh no, you're wrong about this. I literally have not seen one. But I don't get any applause for that because I'm not on script, am I? I'm not following the correct script that everyone's agreed on, apparently. You know, so if you share what I say on that topic, even if you can't find flaws in the argument, and seriously, if you do, please let me know, you will be published. You can't share that because it would make you an outsider, maybe. So that's the message, guys. Reject herd mentality, both in others and also in yourself. Lesson 5 from On Tyranny is remember professional ethics. And this one hits kind of close to home for me because as a former lawyer, I had a very strict practice code that I had to adhere to, and that in many ways I still adhere to today, despite not being formally bound by it. Confidentiality is very important to me still, and I still have this contractual way of looking at interactions whereby I'll act in certain ways that I know you're likely to predict, so that in case you base your actions on what you think I'll do, you won't be screwed over by me doing something unpredictable. Anyway, the author Snyder proceeds to list a bunch of lawyers who worked for Hitler and who in some cases were responsible for some of the most gruesome acts of the war. There's this one guy who was Hitler's personal lawyer, and then he became the governor of Poland and oversaw much of the brutality of the Polish Holocaust. And he had this justification for what he was doing, saying that the law exists to serve the race, and so if it's good for the race, then it's legal. This makes me shake my head on so many levels, because it's such an absurd perversion of Nietzsche's ideas on morality. But it's doubly shameful because the idea of the rule of law is so sacred to a fair society. This idea that the law is above rulers, it's above utility, it's above politics. It shouldn't be twisted to serve your purposes. But you see, the law isn't the point, because doctors broke their code of conduct to conduct human experiments on Jews, businessmen exploited the slavery of the concentration camps, and so on. Your professional ethics matter because they serve as a higher ideal to serve, and at times they may provide a compass of sorts, what they call now a true north, that you can follow when the demands of the regime cross over the ethical boundaries, as well as they can also provide a strong justification for refusing to follow those orders. This is hopefully what's happening in the US now, where we're more and more relying on lawyers and judges to maintain their professional integrity in the face of increasingly alarming demands from the admin. But I want to throw a curveball in there. I see a lot of people applauding when the guys in the intelligence community break their code of conduct by leaking info, by going behind the president's back, or possibly refusing to follow orders. In this case, I think we agree it's a breach of professional ethics, but it's in service of some higher good. And in a way I see the appeal of that, because we agree that Trump and his crew are either dangerous or incompetent or both. But should we really be okay with this? Should this become the norm? Because with deep government working against or behind the back of the administration, depending on whether they agree or not, I feel you cross a line. It's a difficult question because, of course, we want to avoid any form of autocracy. But is there a point where insubordination from the military or the secret services, if it becomes normalized, can be an even greater danger than an authoritarian president? I don't know.